titles: 1922, Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau, acquired through the courtesy of La Cinémathèque Française. Presented with closed captioning by Vitac, a Merrill Communications company. Recording services provided by Dominion Post, with audio description provided by Audio Description Associates and the American Council of the Blind's Audio Description Project. In black and white. From the novel by Bram Stoker, adaptation by Heinrich Galeen, photographed by F.A. Wagner, art direction by Albin Grau. Cast: Count Dracula, the Vampire, Max Schreck. Renfield, an estate agent, Alexander Granat. Jonathan Harker, Renfield's clerk, Gustav von Wagenheim. Nina, his wife, Greta Schroeder. Westenra, Harker's friend, G.H. Schell. Lucy, his wife, Ruth Lanshoff. The professor, John Gottout. The town doctor, Gustav Batz. Captain of the Demeter, Max Nemitz. First mate, Wolfgang Heinz. From the diary of Jonathan Cavallius, able historian of his native city of Bremen. Nosferatu. That name alone can chill the blood. Nosferatu. Was it he who brought the plague to Bremen in 1838? I have long sought the causes of that terrible epidemic and found at its origin and its climax the innocent figures of Jonathan Harker and his young wife, Nina. Seen from above, the cupola at the top of a Gothic tower, beyond the open plaza of a town. Now, Harker, a man with long dark hair, wearing a long-sleeved white shirt and a brocade vest, stares into a mirror, tying a white bow tie. He smiles, then turns to a nearby window. A woman with curly dark hair, Nina, is at a window framed by flower boxes. She dangles a ball on a string in front of a tabby cat. The cat bats at the ball. Outdoors, Harker pulls blossoms from stems in a field. Nina sits and sews. Harker, with a broad smile, opens a door. He holds his hands behind his back. Nina looks up and grins. He laughs, leans forward, and runs to her. They embrace in a twirl and kiss several times. He takes her wrists down from his chest and presents a bouquet. She caresses the small blooms and looks to him. Harker buries her head at his shoulder. A brick byway. Harker approaches briskly from a distance and doffs his hat, greeting an older gentleman. Wait, young man. You can't escape destiny by running away. They shake hands. Harker hurries off. The older man, wearing spectacles, shakes his head. The agent Renfield was a strange man, and there were unpleasant rumors about him. On a stool leaning over a high desk, Renfield, balding and with bushy eyebrows, studies a document. The document is written with odd symbols and pictographs. Renfield seems to read it, scanning it with his eyes, and looks up slowly with a broad grin and wide eyes. He returns to the document. At its end, Renfield again looks up slowly, his eyes almost rolling back in his head. Harker approaches Renfield from another room as Renfield hastily folds the document. Here is an important letter from Transylvania. Count Dracula wishes to buy a house in our city. Renfield leers. Harker looks away. It's a good opportunity for you, Harker. The Count is rich and free with his money. They grin as Renfield continues. You will have a marvelous journey, and young as you are, what matter if it costs you some pain, or even a little blood? Renfield laughs. Harker stares at him. Renfield points Harker toward a map on a nearby wall as Renfield examines the symbols on the document's other side. Harker traces a route on the map. Renfield furrows his brow as if in thought. Harker returns to Renfield, smiling. Renfield leans in and then turns and points. Outside a window, a dark and massive row of 4 gabled buildings seem to lean slightly to the right. The house facing yours, that should suit him. Leave at once, my young friend, and don't be frightened if people speak of Transylvania as the land of phantoms. Harker grasps Renfield's right hand. Renfield claps it repeatedly with his left as the 2 men laugh. Nina, wearing a white shawl and holding a small book, looks out an open window. She sets down the book and adjusts her shawl as Harker rushes in, placing his hat by the book. He clasps her hands. I may be away for several months, Nina. Renfield is sending me to some lost corner of the Carpathians. Nina stares blankly. Harker kisses her on the forehead and darts off. He returns to retrieve his hat and leaves hurriedly. Nina turns slowly, her face ashen. Harker packs a duffel bag. He pauses and then retrieves a book from a desk. Slowly, Nina moves to him, eyes wide, staring. Harker embraces her, and they kiss. He presses her to his chest. She looks down. Harker left Nina with his good friends, Westenra and his wife, Lucy. Plodding, Nina and Harker emerge from a home with winding outside steps. Nina is enveloped in a black outer coat and bonnet. Harker wears a light-colored overcoat. As they kiss, Westenra and Lucy stand in the doorway. Harker pulls away and leans on the step's armrail. Don't worry, Nina. Nothing will happen to me. Westenra shakes Harker's hand vigorously. Harker hurries away as Nina sobs. Suddenly, Nina looks up and runs to Harker. They embrace again, but Harker pulls away. Lucy, all in white, joins Nina. Outside a large home, a horse grazes. A man arranges the animal's reins as Harker mounts the steed and they depart. From relay to relay, through the dust raised by the stages, Harker hurried on. A vast mountain range towers over a forest of sparsely set trees with slender, leafless trunks. A small wagon pulled by 4 horses stops outside a small inn. Harker's duffel is tossed from the wagon. Harker steps out, greeted by a man who takes his bag. The man, balding and with a bushy mustache, wears a blouse with loose, decorated sleeves, a thin vest, and an apron. Harker follows him into an area with tables and chairs and other people assembled in the background. The man places Harker's bag on a table, and Harker sits at the table. The man beckons to a woman who brings Harker a glass of liquid. Harker downs it briskly and then pounds the table. "Dinner, quickly! I should already be at Count Dracula's castle." Women huddle, jaws open. A man stands and gapes at Harker. The innkeeper, cleaning glasses, stops abruptly. Harker turns around. The innkeeper furrows his brow, shakes his head, and gradually goes to Harker. "You must not leave now. The evil spirits become all-powerful after dark." Harker laughs and brushes the man away. A wolf-like creature scurries down a rocky ridge. Horses look up and turn, prancing away. A small room features a tiny window, wash basin, and a wooden bed in an alcove. A woman sets a candle on a table. Harker follows her into the room as she pulls a bed cover aside. She glances at Harker warily as she hangs his hat on a peg beside the window and departs. Harker removes his coat and hangs it next to his hat. He looks out the window. Horses trot away along a meadow, skittish and bucking. The wolf-like creature sniffs the air. At the inn, the women cluster together. One matron makes the sign of the cross at her chest. The creature scampers off. At the window, Harker rubs his arms and closes the window cover. He places the candle in a niche by his bed. Harker retrieves a small volume by the candle. The Book of the Vampires. The candle flickers. And it was in 1443 that the first Nosferatu was born. That name rings like the cry of a bird of prey. Never speak it aloud. Harker yawns and places the book aside, then pulls off his boots. In the bed, Harker opens his eyes, sits up, and stretches. Then he darts from the bed and opens the window. Horses trot in the meadow, followed by a man in white. Harker stretches and snatches the book from the bed. Men do not always recognize the dangers that beasts can sense at certain times. Harker laughs and tosses the book away. He removes the top of his nightgown, tying its sleeves around his waist. At the basin, Harker splashes liquid on his face and torso. Outside, fully dressed and with the innkeeper, Harker tosses his bag to his driver, and the coach departs down a secluded and narrow road, with a second driver riding one of the horses. A mountain vista looms past a forest. Hurry! The sun will soon be setting. Harker pokes his head out from behind the coach's curtains and gazes up. Faint rays of sunlight shine from behind dark clouds. The wagon crosses a bridge. The bridge bounces slightly as the wagon rolls over it. The trail has become rocky. The wagon's wooden wheels clamber over the rough terrain, jostling the coach until it stops. Harker emerges and confronts the driver. The driver protests. "We will go no further, sir, not for a fortune." The driver crosses his legs. The second driver has dismounted, and Harker goes to him, patting him on the back. "We will go no further. Here begins the land of phantoms." Harker turns aside, chuckling. The driver hands him his bag before leading the wagon away. Harker strides across a narrow bridge. And when he had crossed the bridge, the phantoms came to meet him. In the distance, above the treetops, a pinnacle towers over the landscape. Another wagon, pulled by two dark horses and a driver clad in black, races down a trail. Harker trods past a rocky ledge supporting a small cupola with arched windows. He continues on the trail, leading uphill. He pauses. The dark wagon, winding recklessly, nears him. It stops, and Harker stares, motionless. Only the driver's dark, lined eyes are visible. The lower portion of his face is shielded by his dark cloak, and he wears a cap that comes to a point with a feather protruding from it. The driver points his riding crop toward the coach, and slowly, Harker steps into the wagon. The wagon turns around and rumbles up the trail. With wind rushing past, Harker leans out of the wagon, closes his eyes, and returns within as the trail climbs and becomes less defined. Amid a forest of towering trees, a wagon slows, goes up a hill, and stops in a clearing. Harker emerges and looks to the driver, who sharply points his riding crop forward. Nearby, a round tower with a pointed roof and a narrow horizontal window near the top. Harker hoists his bag over a shoulder and walks toward a large arched doorway, stepping onto its gangplank. Its stone walls are patchy and rough. He pauses and turns. The coach speeds away. Turning back to the arch, its doors open. Harker stumbles back a step, but then proceeds. Elsewhere, a tall, thin man emerges from a low, curved opening. He is dressed in black, his hands clasped at his chest, his back hunched. Harker continues through the archway. Its doors close behind him. He pauses and looks around, eyeing the tall stone surroundings before moving on. The tall man stands along a path as Harker crosses toward him through another archway. Harker stops and removes his hat. The man points to his own head. Harker replaces the hat. Harker steps closer. The tall man has thick eyebrows, a large hooked nose. A cluster of keys dangles from his hands. "You are late, young man. It is almost midnight. My servants have all retired." The Count motions to the low arched opening and turns. Harker follows him into the dark, cave-like passage. In an open, high-ceilinged room with a checkerboard pattern on its floor, the Count sits in a high-backed chair at one end of a table. Harker is seated to the left. Surrounded by food and eating from a plate, Harker peers toward the Count, who intently scans a document with his wide, dark-lined eyes. The document is scrawled with symbols. Harker reaches for a loaf of bread and a knife and begins to slice a piece. The Count, his face behind the document, slowly lowers the sheet past his eyes. A clock with Roman numerals, with its hands at 12, is topped by a skeleton-like image that wields a mallet at a bell. Harker turns sharply, but then looks to his bloody thumb. The knife has cut into his flesh. He pulls a cloth napkin toward it, but the Count stands and reaches out with his long, thin fingers, slowly moving to Harker, eyes wide. "Blood! Your precious blood!" The Count grabs at the thumb, but Harker pulls away and slowly backs off as the Count stalks toward him. Harker backs into an area on a platform with a fireplace and two wide, ornate chairs. He pauses as the Count confronts him. "Let us chat together a moment, my friend. There are still several hours until dawn, and I have the whole day to sleep." The Count bows and motions to the seating area, and Harker, his mouth open, backs up and ascends 2 steps to the raised area. Backing into a chair, the Count bows again, arms out, and Harker sits. The Count joins him. As the sun rose, Harker felt himself freed from the oppressions of the night. Now, Harker is slumped in his chair, eyes closed. With a start, he looks up and slowly stretches, casting a shadow on the wall above the fireplace. He grins and stands, and then looks toward his thumb. He adjusts his collar and bends down to retrieve a small mirror from his bag. His neck is reflected in the mirror as Harker fingers his collar and 2 marks on his neck. He smiles slightly. Replacing the mirror, Harker yawns broadly. The table is still laden with food and drink. He steps briskly to the table and sits, carving meat and pouring a glass of wine. In the background, the clock's hands are at 6:35. Now, outside, Parker strides down steps and onto a path in a courtyard. He walks up a short staircase to a gazebo-like area or cupola, six-sided with 6 archways. Parker smiles broadly, looking toward the forested vista. He pulls out a sheet of paper and a marker and writes. Nina, my beloved, don't be unhappy. Though I am far away, I love you. This is a strange country, amazing. Then Parker frowns and uses the sheet to swat at the air and resumes his letter. After my first night in this castle, I found 2 large bites on my neck. From mosquitoes? From spiders? I don't know. He reaches toward his neck and grins. I have had some frightful dreams, but they were only dreams. You mustn't worry about me. A man in a white coat rides a horse in a clearing. Parker rushes to the gangplank at the arched entranceway and waves. The rider pauses and then gallops toward the castle. Parker greets him on a path and hands him the letter. The man turns and rides off. Dark clouds hang over the area, blocking the sun's light. As twilight came on, the empty castle became alive with menacing shadows. Parker stands beside the Count, seated in his high-backed chair. The Count peruses several sheets and turns to Harker. Parker reaches to his bag on the table and pulls a sheet from an envelope, opening it for the Count. Next to the envelope, a round locket. The Count stares at the image in the locket and holds it before his large eyes, then turning to Harker. The Count pulls the locket closer. Is this your wife? What a lovely throat. The Count hands the locket to Harker with his spindly fingers. Harker tucks it into an inner coat pocket. The Count looks to the document and grasps a long quill pen. That old mansion seems quite satisfactory. We shall be neighbors. The Count scrawls on the document and looks to Harker, who folds up the sheet and stuffs it into his bag. Now Harker, alone in another room, looks at the locket and tenderly brings it to his lips. Returning it to his bag, Harker pulls out his small book, slowly opening it. Nosferatu drinks the blood of the young, the blood necessary to his own existence. Parker glances away, but turns back to the volume. One can recognize the mark of the vampire by the trace of his fangs on the victim's throat. The skeleton clock strikes 12. Parker turns abruptly, holding the book behind his back. He goes to the arched wooden door of his room, puts the book in an inside coat pocket, and slowly pulls the door open. The Count stands in the distance, his shadow on the wall behind him. His head covering is gone, revealing his bald pate and pointed ears. Fangs protrude from his mouth. His face is gaunt and bony. Harker pulls back and closes the door, eyes wide and face ashen. He backs away and then rushes to his window. A waterfall gushes nearby. Harker moves to his bed, fully clothed, and reclines against the backboard. Suddenly, the door to his room swings open. Harker, his chest heaving, turns away. With light glaring from behind, the Count paces through the doorway, his long arms at his sides. Harker pulls a sheet over his head as the Count steps closer. Nina, her hair in ringlets, lies in bed, eyes closed. Her eyes open wide, and she sits up in bed. Elsewhere, Harker's friend, Westenra, sits at a desk writing while smoking from a hookah pipe. Nina, staring ahead, steps from bed in her white nightgown and bare feet and paces to an open veranda door. That same night in Bremen, in a somnambulistic dream, Westenra looks up from his desk, puts aside his quill pen and pipe, and leaves. Nina, her arms held out in front of her, walks on her toes along the top of the railing along her veranda. Westenra appears in Nina's room. Nina? He rushes to the veranda. As Nina falls, Westenra catches her in his arms. A man opens the door to Nina's room. "The doctor, quickly!" The man departs. Harker lies slumped in a corner. The Count's shadow appears on Harker's body and grows larger onto the wall behind. The Count's hands are raised, his fingers stretched wide, and his pointed ears protrude from his round head. In Nina's room, she lies in bed attended by a doctor, a bearded man in spectacles, while Westenra and Lucy stand nearby. Then, Nina sits bolt upright, her mouth open and her eyes wide. She reaches out. "Jonathan! Jonathan! Hear me!" The Count's shadow lowers on the wall, and then, in profile, the Count stands and turns to his side, glancing behind. Nina, breathing heavily, stretches her arms. The Count turns and paces through Harker's doorway. The door swings shut. Nina sits slumped in bed. The doctor supports her. She heaves a sigh and falls back as Lucy and Westenra look on. Westenra grasps the doctor's shoulders. He turns to Westenra. "A sudden fever." The doctor laid Nina's trances to some unknown disease. Since then, I have learned that she had sensed the menace of Nosferatu that very night, and Harker, far away, had heard her cry of warning. The sky brightens over the silhouette of a rolling horizon. Harker, in his bed, abruptly sits upright. He reaches to his throat and turns toward his doorway. Closing his eyes, he brings a hand to his forehead. He jumps from bed and rushes to the door. He opens it and strides through the Count's dining area. Turning to the right, he appears at a landing and stairway. Climbing down the steps, he arrives at a wide doorway set within an arch. He tugs on the right side of the door, pulling it open. Descending a flight of stone steps, Harker comes upon a coffin set on a low stone platform. Stepping up on the platform, Harker leans over the coffin. Through its splintered top, the Count glares from within. Harker falls back, pauses, but then lunges for the coffin and pushes back its cover. The Count, eyes open, lies motionless on his back, his hands crossed at his waist. Harker stumbles back toward the steps, collapses, but scrambles up the stone steps. A thinning forest is set against a dim gray sky. Harker is propped against a wall in his room at the Count's castle. He struggles to his feet and looks out a window. The Count is loading coffins on a cart drawn by 2 horses. Harker clings to the side of the window as the Count places the lid to a coffin at the side of the cart, loads the coffin on the cart, climbs onto the cart, and into the coffin. The lid drifts up and onto the coffin as the horses pull the cart away. Harker backs down from the window and sinks to his knees, a hand pressed against his forehead. He looks toward the room's other window and rushes to his bed, pulling off its quilt and sheet and ripping the sheet into narrow strips. Next, in his coat and hat, Harker lowers himself out the window, clinging to the strips of bedsheet. Dangling from the end of the sheet, he leaps to the ground and lies on his back. He props himself up on one elbow, but then falls back, limp. A rushing river, a barge loaded with coffins appears. 2 men guide the barge with long oars. The men little suspected what terrible cargo they were carrying down the valley. Now, in a room, a woman in a nun's habit and a middle-aged man lean over Harker in a narrow bed. The man turns to the nun. "Some peasants brought him here last evening. He still has a high fever." The man holds Harker's wrist when Harker sits up in the bed. The nun holds him as he turns, reaching out. "Coffins! Coffins filled with earth." Harker clings to the nun, who gently eases him back. On a wharf, laborers lift the coffins, loading them elsewhere as a man carrying papers arrives with 2 other men. The first man gestures to the coffins. Another man points to a page, and the first man grins. He points to the laborers who lift the lid from a final coffin. The first man inspects the earth-filled interior, and the laborers turn the container over. Rats spill out and scurry amid the dirt. One laborer bends over the creatures, and one rat nips at his foot. Grabbing at his foot and hopping, He reaches for a shovel and pounds the rats, then limps away. Nosferatu was en route, and with him, disaster approached Bremen. At the same time, Dr. Van Helsing was giving a course on the secrets of nature and their strange correspondences to human life. The professor told his students about the existence of a carnivorous plant. In a home setting, the elderly professor wears a long gown and stands on a platform at a table. 5 other men observe the professor. The table is laden with books and a small potted plant. The plant has curved and prickly leaves. They are in 2 parts connected by a hinge-like mechanism. On the edge of the leaves, spiky appendages like thorns. As the men lean in, a fly teeters along one leaf. As the fly crawls toward the center, the leaf springs shut, with the edges meshing like bars. The professor looks over his spectacles at the assembled men. Astonishing, isn't it, gentlemen? That plant is the vampire of the vegetable kingdom. Nosferatu held Renfield under his influence from afar. Now an older man sits at a desk as a guard approaches. That patient who was brought in yesterday has gone out of his mind. The 2 men leave the room and arrive in a cell. In a corner, a small bench on which Renfield is huddled. He laughs and grasps at the air as if grabbing at a fly, then placing it in his mouth. Blood! Blood! The 2 men observe Renfield cautiously, the older man stroking his beard. Renfield stands, plucking at flies, but then jumps at the older man. The guard pulls Renfield back to his corner. The professor probes the dirt in a wood box. He looks to his students. And now, gentlemen, here is another type of vampire, a polyp with claws. A strand of material branches out at its base into 6 claw-like appendages. A tiny organism is snagged by the polyp and grows still. Transparent, without substance, almost a phantom. The strands of the polyp entwine around the organism. Renfield is held back by the guard. Renfield's gaze drifts up and he points. A spider wraps prey at the middle of an intricate web. The older man comes closer to Renfield and points to the guard, who proceeds to bind Renfield with a length of rope. Nina was often seen alone among the dunes, watching and waiting for her husband's return. Nina, clad in black, sits alone on a bench between 2 sand dunes. The sea ripples gently nearby, and wind ruffles her dress and hair. Crosses impale the dunes at odd angles. From afar, two figures atop a ridge wave. Nina turns as Lucy and Westenra scramble down a dune. Lucy, in a white dress, hands Nina an envelope. Nina pauses and hands the envelope back to Lucy, who quickly opens it. Nina, her hands clasped at her chest, looks intently to Lucy. I have had some frightful dreams, but they were only dreams. You mustn't worry about me. I am leaving immediately to return to Bremen and to you. Nina clutches the envelope to her bosom, stands unsteadily, and runs off along the dunes. Parker, fully dressed, sits on the edge of a bed, wearily pulling on a boot. A nun stands nearby. She assists him to his feet, and he offers a slight smile. But then, breathing heavily, he turns away sharply and grabs his hat from the bed. He clasps the nun's hands for a moment and then walks away. The nun shakes her head. Now a sailing ship at sea. Parker leads a horse through brush and down an embankment. The multi-masted ship plows on. Renfield's cell. Now dressed, he sits in the small room. Odd shapes are scratched onto one wall. As the guard sweeps near Renfield but facing away, Renfield eyes newsprint in the guard's coat pocket and snatches it, hiding it behind his back. As the guard departs, Renfield peruses the sheet. New plague baffles science. A mysterious epidemic of the plague has broken out in Eastern Europe and in the port cities of the Black Sea, attacking principally the young and vigorous. Cause of the two bloody marks on the neck of each victim baffles the medical profession. Renfield grins and drops the sheet. He rubs his knees while staring ahead in a broad smile. The sails of the ship are full. The sea rushes past. Parker, on horseback, carefully fords a stream. Its white water flows swiftly along rocky terrain. Aboard the ship, a man emerges from below deck and crosses the length of the ship toward another passage to below deck. Descending steps, he goes quickly to a gentleman with long sideburns at a meal. He smokes a pipe and swills a glass of wine. Aboard the Demeter, first one man was stricken, then all. The pipe-smoking captain leads the other man back to the deck. Again, below deck, a thin man lies in a hammock. The captain and his mate descend steps and go to the stricken sailor. The captain observes the man for several moments, but then responds to him with a quick gesture of disdain, speaking to his mate. The mate pulls a flask from a pocket and hands it to the thin man. He drinks from it eagerly until the mate retrieves it, places the man's hands together, and covers him with a blanket. The mate returns above deck, and the stricken man turns over and stares. Amid the coffins, Nosferatu is perched on one, ghost-like and transparent. walks his horse down a steep hill amid a forested area. Trees cast long shadows in his path. One evening at sundown, the captain and his first mate buried the last man of the crew. On deck, the first mate ties rope around a long and narrow canvas-wrapped bundle the size of an adult male. The captain makes the sign of the cross, and the two men lift the package to the side of the ship and push it overboard. The first mate, downcast and weary, reaches for a small axe. "I am going below. I want to have a look in the hold." He slowly turns his gaze and moves on. The mate descends the steps into the hold. The hammock is empty. Wielding his axe, he approaches one of the coffins and chops into it. Rats emerge through the two gaping holes. Suddenly, he looks up as the lid of another coffin rises, and Nosferatu, his body stiff, rises from the coffin, eyes wide, and his long, claw-like fingers outstretched at his sides. The first mate holds up his arms, trembling, and drops the axe as he hurries away. Nosferatu reaches out to him with one arm. The mate reaches the deck, his face distorted in a wide grimace. The captain is at the ship's wheel and watches as his first mate backs away and clambers over a barrel at the side of the ship. As the captain reaches out, his first mate slips overboard. The captain grabs a nearby length of rope and lashes himself to the wheel. Seen from the hold below, Nosferatu paces past to the right, plodding slowly with fingers outstretched. The captain looks to the left, his mouth agape. Despite all sorts of obstacles, Harker pushed on towards Bremen. Meanwhile, driven by the fatal breath of the vampire, the vessel moved rapidly towards the Baltic. The ship bobs in the water as the wind picks up and the sea becomes more turbulent. Nina stands in the doorway of her veranda, barefoot, wearing her white nightgown. Tree limbs sway, and the sun is obscured by long, dark clouds. A coach drawn by 4 horses travels past a large house and field. Nina, on tiptoe, glides to the railing of the veranda with both arms outstretched. Waves roil and toss. The ship heaves up and down. In a bedroom, Lucy sleeps in a canopied bed. Sheer draperies billow at an open window. Lucy awakens with a start and looks up. Hurriedly, she jumps from the bed, dons a robe, and rushes from the room. She discovers Nina on the veranda, arms raised, reaching toward the sky. Nina turns slowly, trance-like, and smiles softly. "He's coming. I must go to meet him." Nina goes into her room. The coach slows near a tall tree. It stops just as the driver falls to the side. Harker jumps from the coach and climbs up to the driver's seat and leans over the driver. With a forceful downward motion of his arm, he jumps down and sets off on foot. Nina, wearing a shawl over her nightgown, runs from Lucy's home. The waves churn and grow darker. Most of the ship's sails are full. One sail has a hole torn in it. Now Renfield's cell. The shadow of barred windows plays on the wall. Renfield brings a step stool to his bed, stands on it, grasping the bars and pulling himself higher. He peers through the window. In the river, the ship drifts by. The Master is coming! The Master is here! Renfield's mouth is wide open and he smiles broadly as he lowers himself from the window. Excitedly, he places the stool by the side of his bed and then looks up. Quickly, he climbs back in bed, sitting on his knees. The ship. A length of canvas covers a hatch above the steps down to the hold. Suddenly, the canvas pulls back and the hatch slowly rises. Nosferatu peers from below. His eyes now seem to glow. At Renfield's cell, a guard clears a plate and then bends over, lighting his pipe at a lantern. Renfield rises on his mattress and jumps on the guard's back, pulling him to the floor. Renfield stands and runs off. I have long tried to understand why Nosferatu traveled with the earth-filled coffins. Recently, I discovered that to preserve their diabolic power, vampires must sleep during the day in the same unhallowed ground in which they had been buried. Seen from a distance and through the rounded arch in a tall brick wall, the ship is moored. Plodding through the arch, Nosferatu carrying a coffin. He pauses, looks right and left, and continues along a path leading from the arch. On the ship, the hatch stands open. First one, then two, and 3 rats crawl from the hold, followed by a dozen more creeping into the light. At a row of cottages, Harker appears, striding past. Nosferatu carries his coffin across a cobblestone road. Harker runs toward Lucy and Westenra's home. A door opens and Nina stands at a landing, her arms spread wide. Harker rushes to her and embraces her in a long kiss. Nosferatu, burdened by his coffin, hoists it into a wide yard outside a home. He pauses, looks around, and continues. Indoors, Harker helps Nina to a sofa. She lays her head back as Harker kneels in front of her. Nina turns to gaze at Harker, and he sits next to her. Nosferatu, his coffin in his arms, appears outside the home. He stops and looks up toward the home. Parker, with Nina in his arms, kisses her. Nosferatu turns away from the home, his face contorted in a half-sneer, half-grin, and trots off to the left. Parker holds Nina close. "Jonathan, thank God you are safe. Now I feel that I too have been saved." Now, drifting in a canoe, Nosferatu nears the building he purchased. Next, he carries his coffin toward a sealed doorway. And disappears into it. Outside the ship, men set in place a gangplank leading from the dock to the side of the ship. Several of the men board the ship. The captain is motionless, slumped at the ship's wheel. He has 2 dark marks on his neck. Among other men gathered at the dock is Westenra, Parker's friend, wearing a black top hat and flowing cape. He boards the ship and goes to the captain. Westenra props up the captain, who slumps back on his side. Westenra beckons to the side. 2 sailors untie the captain and carry him by his shoulders. Another sailor descends the gangplank and reports to a gentleman on the dock. "We couldn't find a single living soul on board." The sailor returns on board the ship. Westenra climbs down steps into the captain's quarters while sailors carry the captain's body off the ship. Westenra discovers a large book on a table. He opens it and brings it to the steps in brighter light. Ship's log, Varna to Bremen, 29 April 1838. Past the Dardanelles, east wind, carrying 5 passengers, mate, crew of 7, and myself, the captain. Westenra looks up and shakes his head. He glances back toward the captain's table and then closes the book, bringing it up to the deck. Westenra descends the gangplank with the logbook. Another gentleman hands Westenra his hat and gloves, and they pace away from the ship. In a large room, an official examines the captain's body while others observe. Westenra joins them. He shakes hands with the official, then sits and opens the ship's log. He reads aloud. 6 May 1838, rounded Cape of Inatagron. One of my men, the strongest, is sick. Crew is restless, uneasy. 7 May 1838. Mate reported stowaway, hiding below decks. Will investigate. The official, bearded but with no mustache and wearing dark frame spectacles, shakes his head. 18 May 1838. Past Gibraltar. Panic on board. 3 men dead already. Mate out of his mind. Rats in the hold. I fear the plague. The official takes the ship's log and stands. The plague is here. Stay in your houses. The men leave the room, some pulling handkerchiefs to their noses. A deserted street in Bremen. Only a town crier is in the middle of the byway, striking a drum. Townspeople appear at windows, including a smiling child. The town crier unfurls a scroll and reads aloud. Notice! To halt the spread of the plague, the Burgomaster of Bremen forbids the citizens of this city to bring their sick to the hospitals until further notice. Townspeople quickly close their windows. An adult hurriedly ushers the child indoors. The town crier rolls up the scroll, inserts it into his jacket, and continues his mission. A man dressed in black with a black top hat walks door to door. Many windows are boarded up. He scrawls a cross on two doors with white chalk. He hesitates at the door of a home, then opens a nearby window, speaking with an occupant. He leaves without marking the door, but draws a cross on the door at the next house. He moves on and comes upon four men carrying a coffin from a home. He passes that house without marking the door. Nina had promised her husband never to open the Book of the Vampires, but she found herself unable to resist the temptation. Seated in an armchair, Nina huddles against one side, clutching the book in her hands. She stretches back and sighs heavily before turning to the book. The Book of the Vampires. One can recognize the mark of the vampire by the trace of his fangs on the victim's throat. Only a woman can break his frightful spell, a woman pure in heart, who will offer her blood freely to Nosferatu and will keep the vampire by her side until after the cock has crowed. Nina stares ahead blankly as Harker runs to her. He snatches the book from her. She stands slowly, leaning close to Harker, and then turns to a window and points. Nosferatu's mansion. Look, every night, in front of me. She buries her face in Harker's chest, but Harker goes to the window, staring out. He turns around and shakes his head, smiling slightly. Nina, now holding the book at her chest, trembles and pulls her shawl to her face, sobbing. Slowly, she leaves the room, while Harker stands like a stalwart soldier at the window. Then he turns to the window and backs away, raising his arms at his elbows. Finally, he collapses in a heap on a bed nearby. On a dark street corner, a man lights a street lamp and then tugs on a cord to raise it. The townspeople lived in mortal terror. Who was sick or dying? Who will be stricken tomorrow? Nina lies on a daybed, tossing and writhing as Harker sits by her. She rises into Harker's arms, but then falls back. "Don't be frightened. I will get the professor." Harker rushes from the room. A brisk wind blows through an open window, causing draperies to flutter. A candle nearby goes out. Nina sits upright and leaps from the bed, running to a cord and pulling it. In another room, a small bell vibrates. Harker lies asleep in bed. Nina sinks to the floor, her head in her hands. Now, Nina looks out a window at a line of coffins being carried along the street. He turns away and drops into a chair at the window. On a pillow, the Book of the Vampires. She reads from it. Only a woman can break his frightful spell, a woman pure in heart, who will offer her blood freely to Nosferatu and will keep the vampire by her side until after the cock has crowed. Nina lowers the book and looks up, eyes wide. Outside, an old woman speaks to three young men. All four look off down the street. Then, two old women talk to each other. They saw him escape. He strangled his keeper. They look to the right as Renfield runs down an alley, pursued by a crowd. A man spots Renfield perched atop a gabled roof. Renfield tosses a rock toward the gathering throng. In turn, the crowd throws rocks at Renfield, who grins even as he is struck twice. Renfield climbs down the opposite side of the roof as the crowd swells. He grasps a sign holder just below the edge of the roof, swings down to the ground, and scrambles down another alley. Nina sits in her armchair, threading a phrase onto cloth. Ich liebe dich, or I love you. She pauses, looks up, and sighs deeply before bowing her head and returning to her work. Renfield runs past shops and then stumbling across a dirt road. The crowd appears on the road, rushing past the spot where Renfield crossed. He hides behind a craggy rock, peering above it at the confused crowd as it gives chase in another direction. Renfield runs off. In the distance, a dark figure with arms held out from its torso stands in a wide field. The crowd emerges from bushes and attacks the figure, a scarecrow. One man picks up its remains, swinging them over his head as the crowd drifts off. Nosferatu stands at a window, staring and grasping its empty framework. Nina lies in bed, but awakens with a start. Breathing heavily, she turns toward her window, just beside where Harker dozes in the armchair. Nina clutches her bosom, leans back, and then stands, arms outstretched. She paces to the window, grasping the knobs on its frame. Nosferatu gazes from his window and raises his arms slightly. Nina pulls back wearily and turns to the sleeping Harker, reaching out her hand. Nosferatu raises his hands further. Suddenly, Nina tugs at the window and opens it wide, her arms outstretched. Nosferatu, his hands held like claws, slowly moves to the left, away from his window. Nina leans to the left as Harker sleeps. The doors to Nosferatu's building burst open. The vampire stands in the doorway. Nina clutches her head and stumbles, but then rushes to Harker, holding his arm and waking him. As Harker awakens, Nina falls backwards, and he catches her in his arms. He places her in bed, and she puts her hands at his neck. "The professor! Call the professor!" Nina pulls Harker to her, but then lies back. Harker speeds off. Nina rises slowly and goes to the open window. Nosferatu's building stands in the light of early dawn. Against a bare wall in the Harker residence, the shadow of a railing and the hunched figure of Nosferatu scaling the stairs, his claw-like hands outstretched. Nina turns around sharply. Nosferatu's tall shadow is at the landing, his long, blade-like fingers reaching for the door to the Harker's bedroom. Nina stares forward and slowly steps backward, her left hand at her breast and her right arm stretched to the side. Her chest heaving, Nina backs onto her bed. The shadow of Nosferatu's hand falls on her chest. Nina stares at it and leans back. Harker leans over the professor, Van Helsing, asleep in an armchair. Van Helsing stands, and Harker helps him out of his robe. In the dimly lit bedroom, Nosferatu crouches at left, his mouth at Nina's neck. The town official writes at a desk when a guard comes to him. The official tosses down his quill pen, and he and the guard leave. A rooster at a rooftop crows. Slowly, Nosferatu looks up. Now, Renfield is in his cell. He stands from his corner and glares at the light streaming from his cell window. "Master! Master! Beware!" Harker and Van Helsing walk toward Harker's home. Renfield climbs his wall, grasping the bars at his window. The town official and 2 guards arrive and pull him down. Sunlight sweeps onto the buildings across from Nina's bedroom window. Nosferatu rises and stands motionless. He brings his left hand to his heart. As the light grows brighter, Nosferatu steps away quickly, but he is touched by sunlight. He pulls his right arm up to shield his face, clutching his chest with his left hand. He fades away with a stream of smoke rising from where he stood. In Renfield's cell, Renfield is bound with rope in a corner of the dark room. He looks down. The master is dead. Solemnly, he bows his head. In the Harker's bedroom, Nina awakens and slowly lifts herself up. She looks around, raises her arms, and smiles wistfully. Jonathan! Harker and Van Helsing arrive at his home, and Harker rushes inside. He runs toward Nina and takes her in his arms as she falls back, limp. Harker grabs her shoulders but pulls back and bites his fist. As he bends over Nina's motionless form, Van Helsing stands in the doorway and turns away. And at that moment, as if by a miracle, the sick no longer died, and the stifling shadow of the vampire vanished with the morning sun. High on a hill, the crumbled walls of Nosferatu's castle. The end.